Since music moves through time, how fast or how slowly it moves is one of the most important decisions that a performer should make. We know that tempo was especially important for Beethoven because unlike other composers like Mozart and Haydn of his generation, he started qualifying the normalized tempo markings. So instead of allegro, we have allegro molto e con brio, and instead of largo, we have largo e con gran espressione, for example. Also, Beethoven was one of the first composers to use the metronome and leave metronome markings for a lot of his music. Unfortunately for pianists, however, the Hammerklavier Sonata is the only sonata among the 32 by Beethoven that has the original metronome markings. But pianists can study the string quartets and symphonies that do have metronome markings in order to be more faithful to what Beethoven might have wanted. I think this is very important for performing Beethoven. And while you're listening to the second movement of his Sonata Op.7, I will explain how I arrived at this tempo and why it makes sense to me. I hope this is helpful for you, and thank you so much for watching. Until Beethoven's time, tempo was an indefinite idea which was learned by experience. Leopold Mozart commented that with determination of tempo, the true worth of a musician can be recognized without fail. The Italian terms allegro, adagio, andante, and so on were tempo indications which refer to a range of speed. These were called tempi ordinari. But Beethoven wanted more subtle differences. In a letter to a publisher, Beethoven wrote, "We can hardly have tempi ordinari any longer, since one must fall into line with the ideas of unfettered genius." Musical centers at this time had slightly different conventions of tempi ordinari. So Beethoven's Allegro could have been performed faster or more slowly in France or Italy. When the metronome was invented in 1816, it became a useful tool to communicate an idea of tempi across regions in Europe. Beethoven promoted the use of metronomes so that his music will be performed at the tempo he wanted, and sometimes added metronome markings to the music he wrote decades earlier. The reason why his piano music lacks metronome markings for the most part is unclear. Maybe it had to do with the fact that they were mostly performed privately. Also, we can guess that symphonies, where lots of musicians collaborate in, needed a clearer direction in how fast or slowly the music should be played. Largo means broad or stretched. Compared to adagio, which is a more common slow tempo marking for this period, largo is generally taken to be a slower tempo. Beethoven's first largo was for the cantata for the death of Joseph II, and other largo movements have more of a solemn character, including this movement. When thinking of largo movements by Beethoven, the second movement of Beethoven Concerto No. 3 immediately came to my mind. The opening of the movement is serene, and there is at least a momentary sense of suspension of time. There are other largo movements, and all but one involve a piano. Other well-known largo movements of Beethoven include the Piano Concerto No. 1, the Ghost Trio, and the Piano Sonata Opus 10 No. 3. None of these have the composer's original metronome markings, unfortunately. But Beethoven's students like Czerny left metronome markings for some of these pieces. It is especially useful to note Czerny's marking for the second movement of Concerto No. 3, since he is known to have studied the concerto with Beethoven himself, and he advises 16th note to 66 to 72. In addition, we have metronome markings for all of the movements of the Hammerklavier Sonata. The last movement starts with an introduction marked Largo, and here Beethoven writes 16th note to 76. And he specifies the basic beat as the 16th note. So if we were to apply this tempo to this movement, where the basic beat is an 8th note, I would say, 8th note to 76 would be a reasonable approximation of what Beethoven might have wanted. But to Largo, he adds con gran espressione, which means with great expressions. In slow movements at least, being expressive usually comes from savoring each occurrence of sound or taking time to be expressive. My interpretation of Largo con gran espressione, therefore, is slightly slower than Largo. There is more evidence to support the idea that Beethoven wanted this movement to be very, very slow. He writes sempre tenute, which literally means always hold, where the 16th note accompaniment comes in. This is where a pianist, I myself included, may try to slightly move the tempo had the indication not been there. And Beethoven did not want that. He wants the music to be as solemn as it started and have each sound bear weight. And with patience, the full range of sound from fortissimo to pianissimo, the varied texture of staccato and legato, and the articulation of accents make this music intensely expressive. Playing the movement with a heightened sensitivity to how the sounds move through time sometimes was not natural. At different places, my instinct was to move the music along, and I found myself to be a few notches away from where I started and had to readjust it. Even though my instinctive pacing of music may not sound necessarily wrong, I think that as performers, we should not always go for what feels natural to us. It would be to disregard the composer's originality and put our own personality above the music. While studying this topic myself, I consulted two valuable books by Charles Rosen, The Classical Style and Beethoven's Sonatas, both of which have become basically like the Bible for musicians in studying the classical tradition of music. In addition, Marten Noorduin is a scholar who wrote extensively about Beethoven's metronome markings and tempo in general. I will remember to include the links to these sources in the description box below. I hope this video was worth your time, and I will come back with valuable insights about the third movement next time. Thank you very much for watching.